Hello, everyone. Welcome to Durham Public Library. We are so happy to have you all here, and we're really excited to have our friend and neighbor and local author, Keith O'Brien, here. I will let him tell you about Fly Girls, but what I can tell you is that we cannot keep it on the shelves here. And so there is quite the reserved list for it. So get your copy at the back. Be sure to turn off your cell phones and grab a library calendar on your way out to see what we've got coming up next. And without further ado, here's Keith O'Brien.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. It's good to be back home and among friends and neighbors, and I really do appreciate you coming. I'm going to talk briefly about my book tonight. I will also read briefly from it. That'll all last about 30 minutes, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have and sign any books after that. Since I am among friends, I'd like to begin tonight, if I could, with a confession. And that is, I don't really like to fly. I don't like turbulence. I don't like the little sounds that a plane makes for seemingly inexplicable reasons in the middle of a flight. And I really don't like takeoff. You know, that moment where you're barreling down the runway at 100 miles an hour and jumping off into the air so fast that you can feel the weight of the air and the plane on your chest as you move further and further away from the ground. I actually don't like that feeling at all. I do travel for work, and I like to travel for pleasure. Not flying for me is not an option. So inevitably, you will find me in the 29th row of coach, white-knuckling the armrests as if I alone am holding up the plane. A few years ago, I was on a flight like this. I was traveling from New Orleans to Chicago, and it was one of those flights where the pilot comes on before you takes off and says, "Folks, it's going to be a bad flight." And he was right. You know, in the middle of this flight, here we are bouncing around in the sky in the night in a storm. And I'm like in my seat trying to squirm up into a tiny little ball, but resisting the urge to do that because that would be an insane thing for an adult to do on a plane. And the woman who was sitting next to me, she totally noticed. And she finally couldn't take it anymore. She turned to me and she said, "Honey, I think I can help you. I have Xanax." This is me. This is me as a flyer. And it sort of begs the question why someone like me would spend the last 2 years of his life researching and writing about planes at a time when plane travel was exponentially more dangerous than it is today. You know, why would I do that to myself? Why? And the answer really is, it has nothing to do with planes. You know, I was drawn to the story that became Fly Girls because it is the story of an epic quest. Populated by characters who were willing to risk everything to do the thing they loved, who would fight through adversity after adversity, entrenched discrimination, and even the deaths of their friends. And still they would keep going, still they would keep fighting, only to triumph in the end, beating the men in one climactic race in 1936. That to me is a story I hope anyone would want to tell. I certainly know I wanted to tell it when I stumbled upon it 2.5 years ago. When I write, I always think about my stories in terms of scenes, in terms of moments. What are the most important moments and scenes? Identify those and build around them. So I'd like to begin tonight with you with a moment. And if you want, maybe so we can see the photos and whatnot a little bit better, I'm going to ask Jess to dim the lights. Let's see how this works. Does that feel better to everybody? All right, let's do that then. So let's begin with a moment. I want you to imagine September 1933, the waning days of summer, Labor Day weekend in Chicago. The city had been struggling in the grip of the Great Depression for years now, with record unemployment, bread lines down the street. But that weekend, Labor Day weekend in Chicago, 1933, was going to be different. The city was preparing for a crush of visitors traveling in by rail car and automobile. They were coming for an exciting event. They were coming for the air races. We need to forget about what we know today about our modern air shows, our polished flying events with the world's best planes. Air racing in the 1920s and 30s was a real sport with winners and losers, jackpots of money for the victors, massive crowds. These events would draw 125,000 paying fans in the middle of the Great Depression. Just as many would watch for free in a day from the hoods of their automobiles parked on nearby highways. 500,000 fans in a single weekend coming for the air races. They were, in this window of time, like boxing or baseball, one of the most popular sports in America, and really also one of the most dangerous. Inevitably, pilots flying open cockpit, single propeller machines at a high rate of speed, low to the ground, would crash. And these pilots would sometimes die right in front of the grandstand. And it wasn't just the races that were dangerous. People were also very worried about flying, period. In 1927, which is really when this narrative begins, the Chicago Tribune ran a series of stories stating their concern over the number of flight schools in and around the Chicago area that were issuing pilot's licenses to people, and maybe ill-prepared to do so. And one little line in one of these stories caught my eye, and I thought I'd show it to you now. Highlighted there, officials feel such schools should furnish one or more coffins with each diploma. So this is how people thought of flying. And because of the danger, because of the risks, because of the crowds, because of the stakes, because of the money, many men believed that air racing was no place for a woman. It's absurd, obviously. It's sexist, obviously demeaning. But at the time, actual laws on our books forbade women from doing all sorts of things. From serving on juries, from filing lawsuits, from driving taxi cabs, from working on Wall Street. And if you were a married woman, it was even worse. Especially married teachers. Imagine a world where a single teacher working at Mastway or Mohammed or our middle school or our high school, a single teacher working at one of these schools would have to quit her job at the end of the school year only because she had chosen to get married during the school year. That was the requirement in many communities in this country in the late 1920s. School boards, superintendents, towns mandated that female teachers who got married needed to step down because it was believed by these powerful men that a woman, of course, couldn't handle the stress of teaching our children and also keeping house and raising her own children. So women are banned from many things in our society at this time, and they're denied, other shocking rights as well. Around the time that my story begins, a theater roof collapsed in Washington, D.C., killing a small boy. The boy's mother wished to sue the theater company for negligence, a case she likely would have won. But laws denied her that right. Only a father could collect damages for the wrongful death of a minor child. Only a father. And this boy's father was already dead, meaning the mother in question had no husband, no child, and no recourse. Women hoping to fly planes faced similar challenges. The air races were born really in 1928. That is the first modern air races. And they were staged by this man here, Cliff Henderson, a Nash car salesman in Santa Monica, California. He held those first air races in a bean and barley field just south of downtown Los Angeles. It's worth noting, we know this bean and barley field today by just 3 letters. It's LAX. And so here's Cliff Henderson, forming these races, these modern air races south of downtown Los Angeles. And it was really one of the original all-boys clubs, an old boys network. Men were aviators in these days. Men were invited to race in 1928. And when the women began to push to be included, the men put all sorts of restrictions upon them. Cliff Henderson and others would say that they wanted them to fly in the races while accompanied by a man. And they didn't want them flying in transcontinental derbies over the Rocky Mountains like the men did because they worried about the stamina of the women. In the course of my narrative here, between 1927 and 1936, the men would put all kinds of restrictions upon them, all kinds of rules. They would banish the women more than once, kick them out of the races. When men crashed and died in the races, as they inevitably did, they were treated as heroes. And when women did, they were often blamed for doing so. And really, they lacked the numbers to fight or to stage a real fight against these absurd notions. In 1928, in this country, 90 years ago, in the presidential election, there were 29 million women who were eligible to vote that year. 29 million. Out of that number, fewer than 12, fewer than a dozen, had a pilot's license on file at the U.S. Department of Commerce, which was the regulating agency at the time. Fewer than 12. And that really made the few women who did fly planes true radicals. In Chicago, 1933, one of these women was about to do the most radical thing of all. She was going to race the men, whipping her plane around pylons placed on the ground in a triangular course, small towers, 50 feet tall. She was 29 years old, divorced, and afraid of nothing. Her plane that day was so fast as to be known to be dangerous. It was built by a New Hampshire native by the name of Sanford Granville, who ultimately set up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and built these planes there for a few years at the beginning of the 1930s. This plane had killed many men, but she knew what she was doing. She knew how to fly it. And at the end of lap 1 in the pylon race that Labor Day, the crowd knew it too. As she reached the home pylon in Chicago, in front of the grandstand, flying 220 miles an hour, just 70 feet off the ground, she banked her plane so hard, so perfectly, that it stood up on its wing. Just look at that girl, the announcer said. Those are his words. Just look at that girl. Have you ever seen such a beautiful race? She was trailing the 2 leaders, but she was vying for 3rd place. She was right there. And then on the 8th turn at the home pylon, a problem. The right wing of her speedy plane began to disintegrate in mid-flight. Chunks of this wing, built out of spruce and linen, tore off and fluttered to the ground like so much confetti. And with the wind now whistling through the holes in her wing, she did exactly as she was supposed to do. She peeled off course, flying away from her competitors and the crowd, south toward Chicago, out over Glenview Road and Lake Avenue. She was trying to save the people on the ground and struggling to gain altitude to save herself. Everyone now at the airfield in Chicago was watching her little red plane in the sky, knowing one of 2 things was about to happen. She would bail out from a dangerously low altitude, or she would crash. Either way, it probably wasn't going to end well. That woman's name was Florence Klingensmith. Here she is with Amelia Earhart. Now, you probably haven't heard of her. Most people haven't. When we think about women in aviation in this country in the 1920s and 30s, we tend to think about one or two women. Bessie Coleman, the first African-American female pilot in this country, who died in a plane crash in Florida in April 1926, before my narrative begins. Or, of course, Amelia Earhart. And when we think about Amelia, we tend to think of her, flying in solo, alone against this angry cultural headwind. But in the time that Amelia was flying, other women were flying with her, shoulder to shoulder with her in the sky, and they formed this small but scrappy squadron. Each of them was brave. Each of them was bold. Some of them, arguably, were more skilled in a cockpit than Earhart. Today, we have forgotten almost everything about them. Their battles and their losses, their friendships and their rivalries, what they fought for, how hard they fought. We've even forgotten their seemingly impossible victory in 1936. With this book, I hope to change that, reminding readers of this time and these characters, women who stood up for themselves and each other again and again, defiant in the face of rules that were intended to keep them in their place, and also confident in the knowledge of who they were. I'd like to introduce you to some of the other main characters now. Ruth Elder was a flashy Alabama housewife who in 1927 was 24 years old, already on her second marriage, and living in Lakeland, Florida, where she was answering phones at a dentist office. It was not the life that Ruth Elder had imagined for herself. And so in September 1927, just about this time of year, just a few months after Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic, Ruth Elder decided she was going to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. For this plan and this dream, Ruth Elder received a great bit of attention. By the end of 1927, it is Ruth Elder who is the most famous female aviator in this country, and indeed, arguably the most accomplished. But for her flight here with her co-pilot, George Haldeman, for her flight across the ocean here with George, Ruth Elder would really pay an awful personal price. Amelia Earhart, a social worker from Boston, who came next. In our quest to remember Earhart or to solve how she disappeared, we seem to have forgotten everything about how she lived. And the fact is, in 1927 and early 1928, Amelia Earhart wasn't a famous pilot. She was a licensed pilot, but she wasn't doing much flying anymore. She was a social worker in Boston's Chinatown, working at a settlement house there on Tyler Street, helping new immigrants to this country learn how to speak English and get jobs. It is here at this settlement house in Boston that wealthy East Coast businessmen, including her future husband, publisher George Putnam of Putnam Publishing, will find Amelia and pluck her from obscurity and put her on a plane not flown by her, but flown by men across the ocean. First time Amelia Earhart goes across the ocean in June 1928, she is a passenger aboard a plane flown by men. Her only job is to take notes for a book that George Putnam wants to publish about this adventure. And Amelia knows that this is really how it should be. That summer, back in America, swarmed by the press, she will say that, she was just cargo on this flight, like a sack of potatoes. And really it is to her enduring credit that for the rest of what would be a very short life, just 9 more years, Amelia Earhart will make daring flights in an effort to prove that she and other women can do anything, and also in an effort to answer her critics. Because another thing we've forgotten is that Amelia Earhart did have critics. Ruth Nichols, a daughter of Wall Street wealth, born on the Upper East Side of New York, and raised in Tony, Westchester County on the shores of Long Island Sound. Until the Great Depression and the stock market crash in 1929, Ruth Nichols and her family had money, but she desperately wanted everything that Amelia had. And more than any other woman, Ruth Nichols would challenge Amelia Earhart for the title of most accomplished female aviator in this country. And the first bold decision that Ruth Nichols makes is one she makes as an 18-year-old girl in New York. She does not want to get married and marry wealth like her parents want her to do. She wants to go to college. This is her graduation photo in 1924 from Wellesley College, just down the road here in Massachusetts. She went to Wellesley against her parents' wishes. Think about that for a second. As parents now, we want our children to go to college, boys and girls. We want them to have the best of everything. She went to Wellesley against her parents' wishes. And it is here at Wellesley that Ruth Nichols decides she doesn't want to just be a businesswoman, back in New York. She wants to fly. In 1930, relying on the sponsorship of a businessman in Cincinnati, Ohio, Ruth Nichols will acquire this Lockheed plane, and she will quickly begin flying it into the record books. She quickly earns the speed record and the altitude record, the transcontinental speed record, and it is Ruth Nichols, not Amelia Earhart, who in 1931 sets off alone, solo, in this very plane right here, trying to be the first woman to fly all by herself across the ocean. And were it not for happenstance and bad luck, Ruth Nichols may have gotten there first, changing everything we know about women in aviation in this time. Florence Clingensmith, who I mentioned before, she was the daughter of a farmer in rural Minnesota, raised just across the river from Fargo. By 1927, Florence, just like Ruth Elder, is not happy with her station in life. She is working at a dry cleaner's in Fargo, North Dakota. What she really wants to do is fly. And she will, in 1928, convince moneyed businessmen in Fargo to give her enough funding to buy a plane. One of them finally relents and says, if you're willing to risk your neck, I'm willing to risk my money. And so Florence Clingensmith collects her plane and quickly begins flying this into the record books. By September 1933, she is one of the most accomplished female aviators in this country, one of the most accomplished air racers, male or female, in this country, period. Which is why the men invite Florence to race against them in Chicago. And then finally, there's Louise Thaden. Louise was really the scarcest kind of aviator in these days. She wasn't just a woman who flew planes. She wasn't just a woman who raced planes. She was a mother. She had her first child in 1930, her second in 1933. At a time when our culture, and indeed many husbands, expected wives to stay home and raise children, Louise did a very modern sort of thing, the kind of thing that many parents, both fathers and mothers, do today. She tried to have it all. Juggling her personal ambitions and her career goals, which she had, with her love for her children and her responsibilities at home, which she had. And it is really, because of these sacrifices that Louise made during this time, that we have forgotten what an amazing racer and aviator she was. It's really because of her sacrifices that she made to stay home with her children that we have essentially erased her. She's on the right there with her son William. That's William there in front of her, and then her son, her daughter Patsy there in front. So, I want to be very clear about a few things. I did not set out to write a comprehensive history of women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s, where each woman gets her own chapter, that kind of book. This is not what this is. If you were going to write that kind of book, you would need 30 chapters. This is one specific narrative about an ensemble cast of friends who were fighting for the right to fly and the right to race. And, they really were friends. Over the course of my research, I unearthed things that really showed how much they cared for one another, things that have gone overlooked for decades. One of them was a letter that Louise wrote to Amelia in 1935. So Amelia Earhart will go on, of course, to fly the Atlantic solo. I'm not spoiling anything for you there, I don't think. And in 1935, Amelia will then add sort of the match set to that record. She will be the first woman to fly from across the Pacific, from Honolulu to San Francisco. Louise here on the right really did not like this idea. A lot of people didn't. We take this flight for granted today, but at the time, aviation experts gave Amelia Earhart a 50-50 chance of getting 2,400 miles from Honolulu to Oakland in a single-engine plane with a 35-foot wingspan. She makes it, of course, and Louise sends her a letter after she lands safely in Oakland. Louise was born in Bentonville, Arkansas. She was, had this sort of plain-spoken Southern twang about her. And she says to Amelia in this letter, and I'm quoting, she says, "Darn your hide, I could spank your pants. One day you have to tell me why you do things like this." And Louise would go on to say to Amelia in this letter, very prophetically, that she wanted Amelia to rest on her laurels. She told her friend in this letter, "You're worth more alive than dead." This was 2.5 years before Amelia Earhart would go missing. And then, Ruth Nichols here in the middle was also, very close with these women, and had in particular a complicated relationship with Amelia, where they were friends but also rivals. There's been debate over the years, like did they really like each other? I was able to unearth a telegram that I think says a lot. It was one that Amelia Earhart wrote to Ruth in 1935. So several months after Amelia's flight over the Pacific, Ruth Nichols is in a terrible plane crash in upstate New York. And it appears to be touch and go about whether she's going to make it. Amelia by this time is very famous and always on the road. She was in Michigan at the time. And she stopped on the road and wrote a quick telegram to her friend in the hospital in Troy, New York. And it's short, but it's really how she says it. She doesn't address it to Ruth, for starters. She uses a pet name that the other all the female aviators had for Ruth. They called her Rufus. And so she says, "Dear Rufus, get well soon. We can't bear to have you on the sidelines for long." So they cared for one another. They were also, on the face of it, very different. And one of the questions I've gotten is, how were they the same or how were they different? And so I'd like to address that because, on paper they were not, they were cut from different cloths. Their parents were Wall Street traders and lawyers, day laborers and pipe fitters. Ruth Nichols, as I mentioned, graduates from Wellesley College. Florence Klingensmith didn't even graduate from Moorhead High School in Moorhead, Minnesota. But there were a few commonalities that I think is worth pointing out. Number one is, even when they were young girls, just kids, they knew they were different. Amelia used to cut off her hair 1 inch at a time so that her mother wouldn't notice this particular transgression. And of course, she didn't like wearing high heels and dresses. She said she found them cumbersome to movement Amelia wanted to wear pants. Louise was the same. She was, again, raised in Bentonville, Arkansas by a good Southern mother who liked to put Louise in white frilly dresses for photographs. But Louise liked to wear overalls and get dirty with the boys. And she would jump sometimes from the second story of her barn in Arkansas, just to, as she said, see what it felt like. Florence Klingensmith was equally daring. In her tiny little town of Moorhead, Minnesota, in the early 1920s, when she was still just a teenage girl, Florence was known to ride a motorcycle at a high rate of speed around town at a time when teenage girls in Moorhead, Minnesota did not ride motorcycles. And when Florence would pay her fare on the streetcar in town, she wouldn't take a seat on board like everybody else. She would cling to the cowcatcher up front, skimming just inches off the rails. They were different. They were also what we would call today early adopters. We take flying for granted, most of us. It's either the fastest way to get from one place to another, or it's an annoyance. We complain about it, fees and legroom and waits and delays. At the time, there was real magic in aviation. Real romance in the idea that you could fly. And there was also a lot of doubt about it. When this story begins, people are actively debating whether A, we will ever really fly, like as a way of travel, and B, if we do, will we be going by blimp or will we be going by plane? And there's real doubt too about whether we'll ever make it across the ocean on a plane. We now again sort of assume that, of course, Lindbergh did it, and it was no problem. Of course, he did it. Before he goes, there's such doubt about whether or not it will ever happen that engineers are writing articles for aviation magazines about how to build a floating platform in the middle of the North Atlantic where you could land, refuel, and take off again. These women still, amidst all this doubt, not only flew and not only raced, they all predicted that aviation was the future. In town after town, Amelia Earhart would give speeches, and one thing she often said was, one day we're all going to fly, and it's coming sooner than you think. She was right. They were right. And the last thing I should say is, their parents, of course, were different, but there was a similar attitude as to how they were raised. These women came up in a time, when parents, in particular fathers, could dictate to a young girl who she would or would not marry, where she would or would not live. But these parents didn't do that, and especially when it came to aviation, they didn't do that. The parents and indeed the fathers either tacitly approved of their daughter's unusual interest in aviation by looking the other way, or they actively encouraged it, by buying their daughters their first plane ride, by paying for flight lessons, by letting them work with them on their car engine in the driveway, and really in the end, by letting them go. Louise here in 1926 was living in Wichita. She was 21 years old and was working as a coal saleswoman. It was not what she wanted to do with her life. And day after day, as she skirted her sales duties, she would find herself drifting down to the little airstrip in the prairie grass east of town in Wichita, where a man named Walter Beach, which may ring familiar to some people because he would go on to form Beechcraft. A man named Walter Beach was fiddling with his first plane company called Travel Air. It is here that Walter Beach discovers Louise Thaden and decides to hire her and put her in his West Coast distributorship office. And this is a job that Louise desperately wants. Her parents think otherwise. Her mother in Wichita is in tears over this. And her father is threatening to call this Walter Beach character and tell him that his daughter is not going to fly with him anywhere. But Louise talks him out of it. She says to them, "It is the one thing I want to do." And so they let her go. And as a parent myself, I've learned something from all of this, and that really is let your child wear pants or a dress. Let them wear their hair long or short. Let them follow their own path, because as with these women here, you never know where it's going to lead. So I'd like to read briefly from the book, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. So I'm going to read from early in the book. This is the story of Ruth Elder. Yeah, maybe we can turn on the lights. Yeah. Thank you, Jess. So this is the story of Ruth Elder. And if you have the book, I'll be reading from page 30. So we're very early in the story. It is September 1927. Charles Lindbergh has just flown the Atlantic. And he has done so, it's worth pointing out, not just for the pioneering spirit of it all, although that was part of it. He has done it also for a jackpot of money. $25,000, about $250,000 in today's money, had been put up for the first person who could fly nonstop from New York to Paris or Paris to New York. Before Lindbergh goes, many men try first, and they all fail. And many of them die or disappear over the ocean, never to be found again. Lindbergh himself nearly fails on takeoff at Roosevelt Field on Long Island in New York. He barely gets the Spirit of St. Louis off the runway. When he does, he nearly plows into a wall of trees just beyond it. He's so low that many people on the ground believe he's going to ditch. But he gets over the trees, the first miracle. He disappears into the mist, and he will then fly for 33 hours. 33 hours alone in the Spirit of St. Louis over the ocean. Of course, he makes it. He wins the $25,000. He wins the fame that comes with it. He wins the book deal, and an additional then $50,000 paid by the Guggenheims to have Lindbergh fly the Spirit of St. Louis across America that summer in a goodwill tour. 90 cities that summer and fall. And it is really here in this moment that America catches what they described as air fever. And it has an unlikely side effect, or at least one that the male aviation officials hadn't counted on. Women now want to fly across the ocean, and it's worth noting they will do it for free. Ruth Elder breezed into Long Island that September, 4 months after Lindbergh's flight, landing at Roosevelt Field with the subtlety of a gale. Her colorful sweaters were tight, and her brown hair was bobbed in the latest style. The Alabama native almost never appeared without a rainbow-hued scarf wrapped around her head, pinning back her wild curls. Her airship was equally eye-catching. The single-engine Stinson Detroiter monoplane was a brilliant shade of orange. The color choice had less to do with flair than practicality. In a wide expanse of gray-blue ocean, the floating wreckage of an orange plane was easier to spot than the remains of, say, a silver one. But Elder and her male co-pilot, a Floridian named George Haldeman, had no intention of putting her plane in the water. It was too perfect, too beautiful, too perfect, all the way down to the name painted on the fuselage in large, sweeping cursive script, American Girl. Gas bot, runway ready, plane dandy, pilots okay, Elder told reporters in their first meeting at Roosevelt Field, already commanding their attention with her looks, style, and distinctive high-pitched voice. Give us a weather break, and we'll take off then. What's your hurry? One reporter asked. Say, she replied, I've been dreaming and planning this ever since I first learned to fly 2 years ago. Then Lindbergh did it, and I was more determined. I want to be the first girl to turn the trick. I'll do it, I and Captain Haldeman. Do you only want to fly to Paris because you are a girl? Another reporter asked. Well, they've got pretty evening gowns there, I hear, Elder joked. Then more seriously, she added, I've never been to Europe, might as well go this way, get some clothes, doll up a little, come back by boat taking it easy, no flying back for me. The reporters wanted to know everything about her. Was she married, engaged, or were she and Haldeman together maybe? No, Elder replied, no and no, especially to the last question. Say, listen, insulted Haldeman interjected, I'm married. Was Elder afraid, and would she back out in the end? Be honest. Or would her family ultimately talk her out of it? No, she replied again, and no. They've been perfect peaches, she told them. Elder had been in New York for a half an hour, Hadn't even left the airfield to check into her room at the nearby Garden City Hotel, and already the New York press was picking her apart. Reporters described her nose, perfectly powdered. They called her vain, criticizing her purse or her knickers, and they pushed the 24-year-old woman again and again to admit that she wasn't truly serious about our transatlantic plans. "What's this you're doing?" another bewildered newspaperman asked her. "Advertising a movie or just getting yourself well enough known to be offered a vaudeville contract?" "Oh no," Elder said. "I'm really going to fly to Paris." Didn't they understand? "I'm here to fly," she said, quickly. Looking out at the reporters and beyond them the long clay runway where Lindbergh had prevailed, Elder must have felt as if she'd flown the American girl not to Long Island, but to an altogether different world. She was from Anniston, Alabama, one of 7 children raised by Sarah and J.O. Elder downtown on Noble Street. The house there was the latest in a string of modest homes rented by the Elders, with money J.O. made as either a farm laborer or a molder in a pipe fitting shop, all of which wasn't good enough for Ruth, J.O.'s 3rd oldest child and thrill-seeking daughter. She left home shortly after her 18th birthday and moved 60 miles west to Birmingham, the city, she called it. She rented a room in a boarding house there, and her parents figured she'd be back in Anniston soon. Instead, Elder began leading a life that she kept secret and now desperately hoped to hide from the New York reporters. She got a job selling lingerie in a department store, and she got a husband. But the marriage didn't take. She was divorced, and then in May 1925, married again, this time to Lyle Womack, an electric sign salesman. Together, the pair moved to Lakeland, Florida, where for a time anyway, they lived an ordinary life east of Tampa. Elder got a job in a dentist office, and Womack helped introduce his young wife to flying and also to some Florida businessmen who were fond of both golf and schemes. In Elder, the men chasing Lindberghian fame saw an opportunity. The Floridians wanted to put Elder over the ocean, with George Haldeman, a well-known local pilot, doing most of the flying, and Elder doing most of the smiling. They pitched their idea to some wealthy snowbirds from West Virginia on a golf course in Lakeland, and these men saw value in the plan. As financial backers, they would make money by shooting footage of Elder and selling it to Hollywood. There was just one caveat. She would have to say she had never been married. The men were marketing a product, and it couldn't be labeled Mrs. Lyle Womack. The West Virginians, intrigued, agreed to put up $35,000 to buy a plane and make it happen, believing Elder was the right woman for the job. She was, men like to point out, the most beautiful pilot they'd ever seen. So pretty, one said, that it doesn't seem right. She was, to put it another way, the fairest of the brave and the bravest of the fair. She would make it to Paris, or she wouldn't. She would live to tell the tale, or she would die. Either way, the reporters would get their story. Either way, the West Virginians were insured. And either way, Elder figured, it was better than playing out her years working at a dentist office in Florida and making dinner for her husband. The trick was getting Haldeman to teach her to fly and then getting him to go with her across the ocean. He hated instructing women. Inevitably, they always ended up crying about something, Haldeman complained. But Elder wore him down, not with her beauty, but with dogged determination. "I've lived for a while without amounting to a plug nickel," she told one reporter after arriving in New York. "I want to do something that will make people notice me, that may give me an opportunity to get somewhere in the world." "Is it worth risking your life?" the reporter asked. "Yes, it is," she replied. There was really only one way for Elder to screw up the deal, by losing to another woman who had dreams, money, and a plane of her own. That woman was staring out at the ocean too, 300 miles to the north. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
I'm sorry I came in late, so you might have explained this, but how did you come upon this idea to write this story?
I didn't explain it. Good question. So I'm a journalist. I'm always looking for story ideas everywhere. If you invite me to your backyard barbecue and tell me interesting stories, chances are my brain is thinking about, is this a story I could do? And so in the late spring of 2016, I was on a plane, ironically enough, I was flying on this day from Boston to Pittsburgh for a story I was doing at the time for Politico magazine. And I grabbed for the flight a book that had been on my bedside stand for some time. It's Lily Koppel's The Astronaut Wives Club. This is a narrative nonfiction about the wives of the first 7 astronauts. And, you know, one of my favorite books of all time is Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. And so, you know, I wanted to read Lily's book because this is really sort of the mirror story here. And I wanted to really see how had she done this? How had she told this story that I know so well from the opposite perspective, the perspective of the wives? And I'm reading it on the plane. I'm early in the book. And there was just some historical background information about daring women in the early part of the 20th century. And there was one line about an all-female airplane race in 1929 that had featured Amelia Earhart. And it just stopped me, you know, because I, of course, knew Earhart, but I didn't know she raced or that anybody did, frankly. And so it just stopped me. And it rattled around in my brain. And the first thing I did was, you know, I just Googled it. And I don't know what happens if you Google it now, but at the time, all you really got was the Wikipedia page for this race in 1929. It was the first women's air race. It's part of this story here. And 20 women competed in it. And I looked at that list, and I only knew the names of 2 of them. And neither of them had won. So my first thought was, well, who's the winner? And who are the other 17? And for that, you know, I started going to the library. And initially it started here at the UNH library. School was still in. The library was open late. I could, you know, help my wife get our kids to sleep and then leave and just come here to the library and work late into the night, you know, not taking anything away from my day-to-day work. And it was really there, living in old microfilm, living in, you know, digital archives, that this whole world emerged, you know, the world of the air races. And here were these women, you know, fighting to be part of, you know, one of the biggest sports of the time. And it was really, you know, then that I knew there was something here. Yeah. Yes.
You spoke about finding a telegram and a letter. Did you find any journals, and how did you find the telegram and the letter?
So the question is, I spoke about finding a telegram and a letter. Did I find any journals, or how did I go about finding some of those other artifacts? So, you know, these women have all been dead for at least 40 years, and obviously in some cases much longer. So there's no way to go and interview them. And most of them did not have children. So I can't even go track down direct descendants who might have things. And so it really was an archival detective hunt. Now, Amelia Earhart's archives are well known. They're at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard in Cambridge. You can go check them out too. And they're also at Purdue University in Indiana. They're voluminous and well known. But the other women, that was not the case. And early on, one of the big challenges I had was a question, you know, am I going to be able to bring them back to life, to render them in 3 dimensions? You know, not write a boilerplate history, but to have dialogue, to have internal thoughts and fears, dreams. Can I do that? And for that, you really need archives. And you know, I ultimately did track down that kind of information for all of them, but it was a challenge. You know, with Florence Klingensmith, I really did struggle. And I couldn't find her papers anywhere. They weren't at the National Air and Space Museum, at the Smithsonian. They weren't at any aviation museum. They weren't at any university in North Dakota or Minnesota, places she had lived. And I really did begin to wonder if they did exist, because she died young. She did not have direct descendants. And really my last phone call was to the small little historical society in Moorhead, Minnesota. And I didn't put a lot of faith in that call, because I'd already called the Historical Society in Anniston, Alabama, where Ruth Elder was born and raised, and they didn't even know who she was. So, you know, here I am calling Moorhead, Minnesota. I expected maybe a similar answer. And, you know, I called, I explained who I was, what I was working on, what I was looking for. And this man on the phone, his name was Mark Peel. archivist at the Clay County Historical Society. And he says to me, well, I've been gathering stuff on Florence Klingensmith for 30 years. So, I said, well, what do you have? And he proceeded to tell me, that, he had done oral histories with her classmates at Morehead High in the 1980s before they died. And as other researchers and local historians had died over the years, they had all left their papers, things they had gathered, back in the 40s and 50s and 60s to the Historical Society. They had everything by a patchwork of luck. And so, of course, I flew to Fargo, And then with Ruth Nichols, it was sort of the opposite kind of story, For her, it was different. I believed from the get-go that Ruth's papers existed. She was of money. She was from New York. She lived a long time, and she believed she was someone. She knew she was someone. Of course, she would have left her papers somewhere. But again, they weren't at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. They weren't at Library of Congress, the National Archives, any aviation museum. They weren't in Connecticut or New York, any university there. Same deal. Could not find them. And usually, I'm now at this point asking other museums, do you know where Ruth Nichols' papers are? No, we do not. Early in this process, I went to the lakefront airport in Cleveland, which was often the home of the air races because it was centrally located. And there's a little museum in the lakefront airport there. It's about half the size of this room here. It's called the International Women's Air and Space Museum. And I went there for a few days, and I said, I want everything you have on these 12 people, and they brought material out in carts. And when I got to Ruth Nichols, all they really had was a large file folder with photocopies of newspaper stories. And I already had the newspaper stories. So I was like, I'm maybe out of luck here. And, I did next what any great historian would do. I just started Googling it a million different ways. Ruth Rowland Nichols papers, Nichols Ruth personal archives, et cetera, et cetera. And, I would do it in my free time, this little random searching. And one day, a PDF popped up that was a finding aid for Ruth Nichols' personal papers at the International Women's Air and Space Museum in Cleveland, where I'd already been. So I figured, it's wrong. I was there, it's small, there's no way. So I called them, I emailed them the finding aid. I said, do you have this? And the part-time archivist there, part-time job for him, says, well, I don't know. I will go check the back room. I'll go check storage. And I was sort of thinking, well, why didn't we check storage the first time? But whatever. He goes there. He calls me back late in the day, and he said, well, I did find some file cabinets in the room, and it appears to be a lot. And what his definition of what a lot is, what my definition of a lot is, might be different. So I said, can you take a picture of them for me and email it to me? And so he did. And late that day, I got an email with this photograph of a wall of file cabinets. A whole wall. In this cluttered, cinder block, windowless room. And so, I went back to Cleveland. And the first thing I did, they let me in this room. They leave me there. Clutter everywhere. And I just started opening the drawers, Ruth Nichols' collection, and comparing it to the finding aid, trying to make sure, is everything here? What is here? And it was all there, alphabetized by year, by flight, her journals, her diaries, her flight logs, everything. And it was really then, that I knew I would be able to bring her back to life. Yes, Kathy in the back.
It was a pleasure to watch you. Keith was our across the street neighbor while he was writing this.
I was.
First of all, your process, I'm a process nerd, that is a book itself, like your journey of uncovering this. And so that's so fascinating too. And Owen's taking journalism in the high school, so you need to go to this class and talk about this. That's not my question.
I'd love to do that.
Yeah, okay. Well, but I'm just wondering, we ought to buy stocks that you recommend because you are so ahead of the time. Like, this is so timely right now, time and place with what's going on. And we all know you started this a couple of years ago, and sometimes it feels like, wow, he was lucky because, just the way things are going in the news, this story is so timely. But I'm wondering too, if, like with Hidden Figures, how that comes out with this behind the scenes African American presence and so much of, our scientific and mathematical history. Was there an African American presence around this? Could you tell that at all?
Yeah, so I think I addressed part of that before you came in. That's okay. So Bessie Coleman was the first female African American pilot in this country, and the only one in the 1920s. And she was quite famous. Indeed, in 1926, she's more famous than Amelia Earhart, who was essentially, a workaday social worker in Boston. Bessie Coleman was well known, and she died in a plane crash in Florida in April 1926. And so this was devastating to the aviation community, and particularly to African Americans. And it would be years before there would be other African American female licensed pilots in this country, the early 1930s. Many of them trained in Chicago, but it was a very small subset, at the time. So it was, like America at this time, it was dominated by Caucasians, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of two-part question. First of all, for the kids that are here in the room, talk to us about how that detective in you kind of meets the writer. And did you ever think, coming out of basketball, would you ever be entwined with this wonderful book with women's issues?
So the questions are, talk to folks, and particularly the kids, about how the detective work meets the writing. And then the second piece, my first book was about, chronicled one season in Kentucky high school basketball. How did I go from that to this? So I'll address the first piece first. So, for starters, I don't believe in writer's block. There's a lot of debate in the writers community. Does writer's block exist? And there are different opinions. So I'm not stating something that's unanimous. But I personally don't believe in writer's block, because I believe if you have writer's block, it means you haven't done enough work. You don't know your story. You don't have the material. You don't know your characters. And so, one of the things as a journalist, forget about writing books, that I try to do is I need to be able to say what my story is about in 2 lines or less. If I can tell you what my story is about in 2 lines or less, well, then I know what it's about. And that means I know what I need to go look for. That means I know who my characters are going to be. And so, with this is a story about women fighting for the right to fly and race in the 1920s and 30s, ultimately beating the men at their own game in 1936. It's 1 line, that's what my story's about. And so now that I know that, I know, okay, Ruth Nichols is critical. You can't do it without Ruth Nichols, not in any real way. And so now I have to go find that. It's not an option. To me, good writing means you've done so much work that nobody else sees. And it also means that, in that voluminous archive I found in Cleveland, I might have only used 8% of it, because I'm only using the best stuff. I'm not going to fill it with a bunch of details that are not germane to my story. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second question now. Oh, right. So how did I go from basketball to this? So they're obviously very different stories on the face of it, but then also not. Because what you need to tell a compelling story is an interesting world. And, that can be lots of different things, but an interesting world, a compelling arc, and then characters that you can root for or root against. That's what people want. If you think about the movies you love, the books you love, it's an interesting world, a compelling arc, characters you want to root for or root against. And so in that way, all great narratives, really do share that. Yes, I'll take maybe one more question right here. Kristen.
In terms of your research process, I know you gathered a ton of information, so how did you figure out what you were going to use, what you didn't, and sort of as you were writing, did you see anything change, sort of, or did you know, kind of going in, know what the story is, even, and then as you were researching?
So the questions about writing it, how did I know what I was going to use? How did I know what I was not going to use, and did it change? So I wrote a very, so I sold the book on proposal, which just to give everybody, let you behind the curtain a little bit. If you write fiction, especially as a first-time writer, you're going to have to give them the whole novel. You can't tell them I want to write a book about this thing. You're going to have to give them the whole novel, unless you're J.K. Rowling or somebody like that. With nonfiction, what you do is you sell on proposal. You basically give them 40 to 60 pages that is essentially a summary of your book. And you give them sort of the arc. You fill a lot of details in there. You're not giving them everything because you maybe don't know it yet. But you also just want them wanting more. And so I had the proposal, which is a good roadmap. If you've done it right, a proposal is a great roadmap. And then I did also, off that, write a much more detailed outline that doesn't look like anything that you were taught in high school or that I was taught in high school. It's just my own way of outlining. And for me, then, as I got into the writing, I knew where a chapter was going to begin and end. So I know where it's going to begin, I know where it's going to end. I often knew the exact scene in which it would end. And more than that, I knew the exact scene in which each section break would end. Like, I read from Ruth Elder, and that dialogue between the reporter, is it worth it? Yes. I knew when I found that, that's a section end. Maybe it's a chapter end. I don't know at that point, but it's a gem. It's beautiful. It's alive. It brings Ruth back to life. It's dialogue. You won't find in this book, any, canned quotes. I'm using stuff that they said to each other, that they recorded in letters, that newspapermen recorded, that radio broadcasters recorded. All that great dialogue is going to be an ending of a section or an ending of a chapter. And I didn't sometimes know what I was going to use, and it did change, of course. It's helpful to have a roadmap, but you need to be willing to let yourself go off of it at times, as long as you get back on it. And I won't reveal it, but if you do read the book, there is the last scene of the book. It even came to me very early on. I knew, within a couple weeks of writing chapter 1, exactly where the book was going to end, and that was so helpful for me to have. I need to work like that. I need to know exactly where I'm going, even if that amazing scene to me is 100,000 words down the road, which it was at the beginning. Just knowing that that's where I'm going is helpful, like at the beginning of a marathon, knowing I'm running 26.2 miles today, right? I know I'm going to the end down there. So that's how I typically work. So I really appreciate you listening, and I want to thank you for coming. And I'd love to close with one last thing, if you'll indulge it. And that is, as a reporter, I have always believed that it's important to tell the untold stories of the underrepresented. And, I think we live in a time where that kind of reporting is more important maybe than ever before. Kathy mentioned a few minutes ago, being prophetic about finding this book 2.5 years ago and having it fit into what's happening now. It was luck. I just saw a great story. But it is undeniable now that the events of the last 18 months, and indeed the last 18 days, have revealed, to everyone what many women in this country have long known, which is that it is very difficult to be a woman in this country, even now, especially when you're trying to make your way in a male-dominated field. And so I do feel like these women would appreciate knowing that their stories live on, that their lives still have meaning. On the day the book came out, about 6 weeks ago now. I was in New York City, and I had just a few hours that morning where I was unscheduled. And I did something that I hadn't had time to do during the reporting of the book. And that is, I took a train from Manhattan to the Bronx to visit the grave of Ruth Nichols. She is buried there in a place called Woodlawn Cemetery. It is a beautiful, sprawling cemetery. It's about 3 miles long. If you were of money and import in the 19th and 20th centuries in New York City, chances are you're buried at Woodlawn. And so I took the train to the Bronx. And when I checked in at the office, because you do have to check in when you go to Woodlawn, and I told them who I was looking for. And they gave me a map. And, on the map at Woodlawn, there are little icons, printed icons for all the famous people who are buried there. And there was no icon for Ruth Nichols. So using the map and the staffer and an app that they had me download onto my phone, we figured out where she was, and off I went on foot about a mile into the cemetery to find her grave. And when I got to where she was supposed to be, it was clearly mistaken. And so I had to stop and triangulate and go again and walk 20 minutes in a different direction. And finally, I found her grave. At Woodlawn, there are giant mausoleums and crypts built in ornate ways, built by people who wanted us to know that they were important. But when I got to Ruth Nichols' grave, it was just a simple tombstone. Jess, will you mind hitting the lights again? Do you mind? It was just a simple tombstone, the kind of stone that we one day might be buried under. And, it just has a few things on it, and I know it's hard to see, but it says her name up top and when she was born and when she died. And then down below in the ivy there were 3 words. It says, beloved by all. And, it stopped me because, she was beloved by all. And they were all beloved by all. And I do hope that they will be again. And I thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So I'll be signing in the back, yeah? So nice to meet you guys. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm Katie. Yeah, nice to meet you, Ty. Yeah, see you later. Hey, Courtney. Courtney, right? Thanks so much for coming out. I want to make sure I spell it right. Is it C-O-U?
Yeah,
T-N-U-Y. I'm good. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out. It's so nice of you. I know you're good. How can I make this out to? Just sign it? Okay, you got it. Hi. To Jean Payne? Okay.